The head, the throne, the reading room, call it what you will. It's a sensitive topic. No one really likes to engage in polite company, but it's a reality. It's a reality that we all have to come to grips with. We all do that a little differently. On Charis, there are a few peculiarities that make this space work well for the way I live aboard and use the boat. When I bought Charis, she had a typical marine head, saltwater flushed. She had no holding tank. I installed one as soon as I got her down here below the shower floor. I had a 15-gallon flexible tank, and it complied with the law. It served the purpose. I had a pump out fitting on deck. I also had a manual pump that I could use to empty the tank when I was in a place that it was legal to do so. But it was problematic. You know, this arrangement that Charis has essentially has the head as a walkthrough from the forward cabin. You pass through the head in order to get to the main cabin, and as a result you pretty much are living with the head, though partially shielded from view by the door, never really separated from the cabin. Now that's an old design that went away in the late 60s, and the separate compartment for head became standard. But either way, when you go on a boat with a standard saltwater flush marine head, there's an odor every time. You really can't avoid it. And there are a number of problems with those. The reality is they function, they do what they're intended to do, but they may not do it as well as you'd like if you're going to live on the boat 24/7. There can be some objectionable parts to that. So one of the issues with a saltwater flush marine head is that every time you flush that head, there are essentially little bioorganisms in the seawater that, when they remain in the system, will break down and create a pretty bad odor. Now, some boats solve that by having freshwater flush. Some boats will have an ability to drain the hand washing sink into the head and use the fresh water you wash your hands with to be the water that remains in the bowl. That's a clever workaround I've seen. But the truth is that in these systems you have a number of hose connections, a number of places where just the tiniest bit of a leak may not even produce a visible result, but it certainly will produce an odor. And if you're living with that and sleeping with your head 4 feet away from it, it can become pretty unpleasant. So when the quote-unquote composting heads became available as a drop-in solution, at that same time on Charis I was having an issue with the discharge 1.5-inch seacock leaking, and rather than install a new seacock, I made the decision at that point to switch over to what the marketers will call a composting head, but in true reality, if you use this thing every day, very little composting is done because there's always sort of a fresh contribution, put it that way. So if you truly are going to compost the waste from this head, you have to have another means to do that, and we have that. I've created these composters, which I consider, pretty simple. It's a trash barrel. There's a clothes hamper suspended in the trash barrel. There are dryer vents installed on the outside. There are screens on the openings for the dryer vents to minimize the amount of insect life that can climb in and out of there. And essentially, each of these barrels will take about 6 to 8 months worth of solid waste from the airhead and allow it to rest, to remain in an atmosphere of good airflow, but isolated so that there's little transfer of any pathogens through insects or anything else. And essentially you just let it break down. So I have 4 of these, and between the 4 of them, essentially what that says is that the minimum amount of time that something can remain isolated in composting is 18 months. And typically after that time, what comes out of these barrels essentially is potting soil. There's no odor. It's fully broken down. There are no clumps. There's nothing to indicate what went in after 18 months time in there. And so these are simple and they work quite well. Now this model is the airhead. This was probably the first of the widely manufactured, commercially available drop-in solutions. And there's also the Nature's Head and several others. There are also several do-it-yourself models that you can build. Basically, this is just an incredibly simple concept, and it is that the liquid and solid remain forever separate. They are not mixed together, and it is that mixing and that anaerobic slurry of waste compounds that produces the offensive odor that we associate with waste. So in this system, you essentially have what is sometimes sold or marketed as a urine diverter. In simplest terms, solids come out the back, liquids come out the front. Doesn't matter if you're male, female, or one of the other 64 flavors. Essentially, you have a way of making the liquid flow into this tank in the front and having the solids flow into this bucket in the back. On the bucket is a crank handle connected to an internal auger. On the back corner, which you can just barely see, is a hose that connects up to this deck fitting and a computer fan. Its purpose is to continually draw air through the bucket containing the solids. For that air to be most effective, what we do is mix in a carbon media. The carbon media in this case is either sawdust or peat moss, or a combination of those two, also mixed in with a bit of stove ash from the wood stove, which I find tends to reduce the amount of odor outside. So essentially this device, as simple as it is, and footnote by the way, these I've heard referred to in many ways. I say composting head in air quotes because the real composting occurs after you've emptied it. I've heard them referred to as human kitty litter boxes. I think that's my favorite. Or desiccating heads. That's another good way to look at it. Essentially, you're drying and producing an oxygen-rich atmosphere for the waste to break down. The one thing I will say about these is you need to have some plan for what happens after, and hence the post-composter barrels that I've created. The objection for municipalities to these comes when people tend to deposit large amounts of solid human waste in trash receptacles that were not designed to handle it. And I think it's obvious that that can lead to public health issues. And some will say, yes, well, there are diapers and there's, pet waste that go in there. But the truth of the matter is, when you start increasing the volume this much, you have to expect there might be some pushback from your local waste handling facility. So if you have a way to do what I've done with the post-composter barrels, you will have pretty much a start to finish solution that is hard for anyone to object to. One guy I knew, when I told him I was getting a composting head, assured me that I would never again be able to have more than a first date with a woman who wasn't dressed in burlap. To this, my answer was, some women look pretty good in burlap. But I digress. One of the advantages to these human kitty litter boxes is the simplicity of instruction. If you've ever tried to talk a guest through the operation of a standard saltwater flush marine head with its valves and pumps and do's and don'ts, and in this case I would mention that mine being installed below the water line was critical that the guest understand that they not leave the C valve open after. The simplicity of this is simplicity in itself. So the instructions that come with an airhead are, don't put anything in the solid chamber that you haven't eaten. And when you decide that the chili dinner I just served you is begging leave and needs to exit, all you really need to do is climb up on the throne, have a seat, reach down with your right hand to this little black lever that is probably hard to see, and flip it downward and open the chamber. If you want to simplify it, you basically just tell them not to release the bombs until they've opened the bomb door to avoid catastrophic explosion. But there it is. Those are the instructions. That's it. You can't screw it up. You can't break it. You really can't do anything to it that can't be cleaned up in a relatively short time. And that's a whole lot better than having to disassemble a system of hoses and pipes to go after that one thing that shouldn't have gone in there. On the port side of the head, allow me to introduce the one I call Mr. Peabody. If you're my age and you watched cartoons as a kid, you'll get the joke. So once I heard someone say that on a boat men have to pee sitting down, and I took real offense to that. God didn't build us the way he did to have to sit down and pee. Let's face it, when cursive writing was still a thing, we were the ones who could write our name in the snow. But all kidding aside, long before I had the airhead, I realized that the biggest problem in the saltwater flush head was that urine has a tendency to create with elements in the seawater, and those would create this shell-like substance that would form on the inside of all of the hoses and gradually restrict the flow through the hoses until a chunk broke away and blocked the whole works, which, by the way, would inevitably happen when the shoreside bathrooms had just been locked up for the season and you really needed to go. So I created Mr. Peabody. What is Mr. Peabody? Well, he is a 1-gallon repurposed non-toxic antifreeze container, a little piece of hose, a valve so that you can shut off the air exchange, although quite honestly there's very little odor that comes out of this. And in this case I used a bleach bottle for the top. I just wanted the white color instead of the opaque. Inside the bleach bottle there's the top from an Old Spice dispenser that is used just to prevent any splashback or gurgling. And essentially this is a waterless urinal. And the lower gallon jug fills. What you'll see here is actually a little motion sensor LED light, born of the ignorance of allowing this thing to overflow when I used it in the middle of the night. So now in the night when you step up, that light comes on, you can glance down and immediately see that you aren't going to overflow before you switch out to one of the spare bottles. So back here there's 3 1-gallon jugs. Essentially it's very easy to contain a week or more of liquid waste and then take it ashore and empty it in a toilet and flush it. That's how this works. I will admit there have been places I've gone where there is no shoreside toilet and facility, and for liquid waste, going well into the woods, far away from any water source, and pouring it out in an area where you see lots of leafy greens growing, you're probably not going to end the planet. And then the last part of this is this bottle, which is just generally a cleaning spray liquid. It's vinegar and water, and that's how you flush your waterless head. So between these two, I find that the solids tank of the Airhead will contain somewhere around 3 weeks to a month's worth of solids. The liquids tanks, obviously much easier to empty, but easily a week or more worth of waste can be contained. Contrast that with the 15-gallon holding tank that I had, which really was only good for 3 or 4 days before I had to get a pump out. So this system allows you a much greater time period. And the other thing I would note is that some of this was born of necessity, because where I live aboard in the winter, there is a point at which the pump out boats can no longer be run. Their systems would freeze. So this is a way that I came up with to deal entirely, number one, without asking for any assistance, and number two, anytime, any place, I can still comply with waste management. And as I mentioned in the video about domestic waste management and galley waste management, the objective here is not to pollute the seawater that I live in, because that seawater is essentially being used on the boat for cleaning and washing purposes. So I'll wrap this with a yarn from the old shipyard days that might amuse some of you. And before the time when holding tanks were a thing, or there were pump out facilities anywhere to make them useful, it was not uncommon for the head on a boat to be in the head, or the forward end of the boat. And this one shipyard I worked at had built a series of these little tour boats, which essentially, in keeping with measures of the times, had toilets with pipes that just went straight down from the head all the way up in the bow to a point just below the waterline at the bow, with nothing in the way, essentially just an open pipe, so everything just dropped and disappeared. This worked reasonably well in the calm water that they were designed for, but as you can imagine, this might not be the best thing going if you were delivering one of these boats offshore, say to an island in the Caribbean, and the crew, of course, needed to use the head on the delivery trip. Well, let's just say that if you are on one of these boats and you are plunging into waves, what they managed to create in this pre-holding tank era was the world's first combination marine head and saltwater bidet. We'll just leave it at that. It supposedly wasn't pretty. And I think the one comment I would make about the solution of a separating or desiccating head as to who is the right fit for what is the audience for this product, my comment would be that if you're the sort of person who wants to take care of your own issues from one end to the other, who doesn't want to rely on a municipality to provide a necessary service, who wants to find a solution that you can handle from all aspects, if you don't mind doing chores, or frankly, if you grew up on a farm and slushing out a barn is something that isn't entirely foreign to you or entirely repulsive, this is a solution that really gives you another level of freedom. It allows you to say, I can do the right thing, whether a given municipality chooses to participate in the process or not. So I think it offers some options for the right sort of mindset. But conversely, if you prefer to not deal with certain aspects of life, you're in good company in the world, and I don't fault you at all for wanting to be able to just not take part in this particular necessity, but rather to call for a pump out when you need one and to go to marinas that have facilities. So to each their own. We each sail our own ship. This entire thing is just to show that this has been a solution that's worked reasonably well for my very specific case and for these very specific reasons. Thanks for stopping by.